Infinite query and infinite scroll are modern React app features that work together. Notice the size of my scroll bar over here in the browser, and as I scroll down and I get near the end of the first 10 results, this scroll bar jumps up and it becomes smaller. That's because the infinite query has requested the next 10 results, and infinite scroll allows us to continue to scroll through these results without stopping, and that will occur until we see the end of the results. So let's look at how this works in React. Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're applying infinite scroll and infinite query results in React. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. Let's look at the starter code for this project, and I've used Create React App, and I've already removed much of the boilerplate code and some dependencies that I didn't need. So you can see all that is left now in the package JSON file that I'm looking at is React, React DOM, and React scripts, but we're going to need to add a dependency. So I'll press Control and the backtick to open up a terminal window. I'm going to type npm I and Axios because we will need this package as we make requests today. So now we've added Axios to the dependencies. Let's look at the rest of the starter code quickly. The index.js has removed the web vitals, but other than that, it is your standard code that you get with Create React App. I have applied some of my own CSS to use today. You can get this from the resources that will be linked to in the description, or you can make your own CSS. And then we have the app.js, and it's just importing in the example 1 component so far, and it's going to return that. And that's all there will be for example 1 until we move on to example 2, of course. And then we have the example 1 component, which currently just has the h1 header and then a back to the top link that should be at the bottom of the results. So where we need to start is creating a new folder, and we're going to call this folder API. And then inside of this API folder, let's create a new file and name it axios.js. In the Axios file, we need to import Axios from Axios. After that, let's create an API. So export const API, and we'll set this equal to axios.create. And now there's an object inside of create, and here we'll set the base URL for today's lessons, and we'll use this in both examples to https://JSON placeholder.typicode.com. This is a fake REST API that I like to use, and it allows us to give some easy examples. And now we need to create a get posts page request or a function. So let's say export const get posts page, because infinite scroll and infinite query are essentially versions of pagination. So we'll be requesting one page of results at a time. So we'll set this equal to async, and we'll get a page, if I spell page correctly, page param, and the default value will be 1 if it's not provided. And then there will also be an options param, and the default value will be an empty object if that options param is not provided. And then inside this function, we're going to set the response equal to await and then API, and that's what we named our API up here. So API.get, and then we need a template literal, so a backtick, and here we'll say posts, or it's /posts, and then a question mark as we need to provide a parameter here in the URL. And for this specific API, it's an underscore, and then page, and then we'll set it equal to, and now we need a value here. So we put the $sign and curly braces, and this will be the page param that is passed in. But after that, we need to put a comma, and then we also need to pass the options here to Axios. And then when we get the response, we'll just return the response.data and save. So now we are finished with this file. Now let's highlight the app file in the file tree just to make sure we don't create the next directory inside of the API directory. And now we'll create another new directory, and we'll name this hooks. We need to create a custom hook in this directory. So I'm going to create another new file and call this usePosts.js. Now this is essentially going to be a use Axios hook, and I have a separate tutorial on that I'll link to in the description and possibly a link above right now. And it will show you how to create a more generic use Axios hook that you could use in this purpose, but today I'm going to create one just for the posts. So we're going to start by importing useState and useEffect, and those come from React. And after those imports, we also need to import what we just created in the Axios file. So it is get posts page, and that comes from Axios. And you can see Visual Studio Code help complete that when I hit tab. Now we'll just say const usePosts, and we'll set this equal to a function that accepts a page number. So I'll call that page num, and we'll also set that default value to 1 in case it's not provided. Now this is where I always like to say export default and get that out of the way so I don't forget it later. And so we'll put use posts there. Now inside of this custom hook, we're going to have some state, and I'll put that in right away. Instead of typing it all out, I'm just going to paste it in and then go over the details here because it's quite a bit of state, and you can pause if you need to copy that over, or of course just get the code from the sources in the description. So what we've got here is results and set results, and that's going to be an empty array at first. After that, we're going to have is loading and set is loading, and that's a Boolean set to false. Same with is error and set is error. And then error itself might hold an error object, so we have an empty object to start out with. And then one other one, and that is has next page, and this is also a Boolean, so we have has next page and set has next page. And I'm just noticing my function doesn't quite look correct because I left the arrow out at the top. Now that looks much better as far as the colors here in VS Code are telling me the code is. And now with these pieces of state, that's exactly what we're going to return from this hook. So I'll just give an extra space and put the return statement here. So we have the is loading, is error, possibly an error object, the results, and the has next page Boolean. I'll remove that extra little curly brace there, and what we're left with is constructing our useEffect here that will handle everything we need to do inside this hook. So we'll just start out with that useEffect, and here inside of the dependencies, as you might expect, it's going to be the page num parameter that is passed to this hook. So now inside of useEffect, and what happens is the request itself for the data. So we're going to set is loading to true to start out with, and then we're going to set is error to false, and then we're also going to set the error to that empty object as well. And this is just essentially resetting some things anytime the useEffect starts, because it's going to make a new request. So we would want to reset the errors if they existed already. Likewise, we need to set is loading to true when we begin the whole request process. So now we can use the get posts page that we have imported, and it's going to receive that page number, and then it's also going to receive a signal, and that's because we want to use the abort controller. So I'll just put a comma there for now, and we need to define that abort controller above, which will cancel the request when the component would unmount essentially here. So that would be in the cleanup function. We'll set all of that up. So we're going to say const controller. We're going to set this equal to a new abort controller, and then underneath that we need to define the signal, and we can destructure that from, let's put in controller right here. Now in the cleanup function that I mentioned, and that would come before the actual, it will become before the close of the useEffect here. So then we'll put it right here, and we'll just say equals, or we don't say equals first. What am I doing there? We start the function, and now we say controller.abort. So anytime this unmounts, it will abort the controller. And of course, if there's nothing to abort, this won't hurt anything. So now we have the signal, and that's what we need to pass in here, which is essentially an option. And since the option is named signal, we can just pass that in as well. Instead of having signal:signal, we just destructure it like that. Okay, after that, let's just start with a dot then right here. And we're going to get data back from getPostPage. And now if we receive the data and everything's going well, we want to set the results. And here we need the previous results. Remember, it's an array. It could be an empty array, or it could have other results in it, like the first 10 or 20 posts. So then we want to set this to a new array. So we spread in the previous results, and then we spread in the new data that we receive as well. After that, we need to set has, if I could spell that as well. I'm having a hard time spelling today. Set has next page, and this will be a Boolean, but what we're going to check is the data.length. Of course, 0 is equal to false, so if there's any other length, that would essentially be true, and it's either going to be 0 or a positive number. Okay, after that, we're going to set isLoading to false. And we'll be finished with receiving the data. But what if there's an error? And our abort controller, if called, does create an error. So we need to handle that here as well. So in the catch, we'll get the error. And now inside of the catch, the first thing we'll do is set isLoading to false. It will no longer be loading, no matter if it's an error from the abort controller or another error that we want to notice. But if it is from the abort controller, we'll say if signal.aborted. We can check that status. Then we'll just return, because we know that's an error that we created on purpose, and it's one we can basically ignore after that. Otherwise, we'll set isError to true. And then if error is true, we need to go ahead and set the error to get the details. So we'll say set error, and now this should be an object, and it will have a message property, and then we'll say error.message. And that is essentially our custom hook. So we're getting everything we need, and we're returning the isLoading, isError, error object if there is an error, results, and has next page. And those are all the things we're going to need in the example1 component. Now let's go to the example1 component, and you can see we don't have much here right now. We just have that heading and of course the back to the top link. So let's start at the top, and we'll need to import useState, and that's going to come from React. After that import, we're pretty well done until we need, well, I guess we need the hook that we just created. So import usePosts, and that's all we'll need right now until we need to create one more component for each individual post. So we'll just start with these two. And then we have the example1 at the top, and then we need state immediately here for the page num. So we'll say const, and then we'll have page num, and then we'll have set page num. We'll set this equal to useState, and we'll start out with a default value of 1 here. After that, we need to go ahead and use our hook. So we'll say const, and then we can put these on separate lines, but we'll have isLoading, and then we'll have isError, and then we should have an error if it exists. We could have results, and then we'll have the has next page Boolean as well. And we can set all of that equal to usePosts, and here's where we need to pass in the page num state. Okay, now we can respond to some of the things we get from the hook. So I'll paste in this line, and we'll just quickly see that if there is an error, if that is set to true, we're going to return a paragraph, and it's just going to display the error. Likewise, down here inside of the JSX, we can check to see if isLoading is true. And if isLoading is true, we'll go ahead and just display that we're loading more posts. And of course, we'll have our posts above this, so this would display at the end possibly as we scroll down. If it wasn't loading the posts fast enough, we would just briefly see this message. And so now we need to create content that will display here inside of the JSX. So above this, but underneath our check for an error, we'll say const content. And let's set this equal to the results that we get, and let's map over those results. And now we'll have an individual post for each time we map through, and we'll have the iterator, that index number. And so then we'll go ahead and say if the results dot length equals I plus 1. That's going to give us essentially the last element that we get from the results. And for now, I'm just going to say console.log, and we'll say well, I need a quote here. We'll just say last element. So we'll know it actually gets that last element. Otherwise, we're going to return a post component that we need to create. And so I'll just paste this in and we'll quickly see the return here is going to be post, well, it says post 1. I need to just call it post here, but the return is going to be this post component, and the key will be the post ID, and then we'll pass the full post into that component. So this will return every time. It's not an if else, and we'll also see that last element log when it hits the last element, because we're going to change something about that soon. Now let's go over here and create our post component. So we'll say post.js, and then we can RAFCE if you have ES7 React snippets like I do, and press tab. If not, you can just make the basic component as is. We're not going to add a whole lot extra, but there are a couple of things we're going to need. And specifically, something that you may have not worked with before, we're going to need a forwardRef here. So at the top of this component, to get that forwardRef, I do need to import React from React, which is usually something we don't have to do anymore unless we're getting something like react.memo or react.forwardRef. So we'll have this const post, and now this is going to equal react.forwardRef. And from there, we need to pass in what it's going to receive. So then we'll have parentheses inside the parentheses here, and we can destructure the post that it receives, but it also expects a ref. So after the curly brace, then we can also pass in that ref. So this second closing parentheses shouldn't be here. It will actually be at the end of all of this. So we'll put it at the end of that component there. Now, why are we doing this? Well, components can't just have refs on them without this. So back here in example 1, when we get to that last element, we're going to put a ref on that component, but we would get an error if we didn't use a forwardRef here. So now inside the component, the first thing I want to do is just define the post body. And this is taking the post title and the post body and the post ID right here. But then we also need some content we're going to display, and that's going to be based on a ternary. So underneath you'll see this ternary statement that I create, and it creates the content, and it's checking to see if there is a ref that's passed in, because only that last result of the page of results will receive that ref. So if there is a ref, it's going to set the article with the ref. If there's not, it's just going to have the article without the ref. So here, all we really need to do is return the content. Let's go back to example 1, and as you might guess now, we also need useRef up here. So let's import useRef, and after we get that ref, and of course after our page num and after our usePosts, here we can define our ref. So let's say const last post ref. We'll set this equal to useRef. Now let's scroll back down to our content where we were returning this post component that we created here. But if it is the last one, we want to return something just a little different. So I'm going to copy this line, and we'll put the return here. Now this doesn't need to be an if else, because the return will stop everything here and set the content. But if this is not true, then the return will set the content here. So no else is required essentially. But here we're going to say post and then have a ref, and we'll set this equal to that last post ref. Now, while we're not finished with our infinite scroll, this is a good time to check out the application. So I'm going to hit Control and backtick, type npm start, let it start launching, and drag the code to the left, and hopefully see a successful launch over here to the right. But I do not have post defined yet. I forgot to import post after we created it. Let's scroll back to the top and import that post component. happens to me too often. Okay, we'll save that now and we'll just check everything once again. We've got results now. It looks like everything is working as expected, but currently we will not have our infinite scroll or infinite query yet, but we do have the first 10 results. And there's the smooth scroll back to the top. Everything is working as expected so far. Let's drag the code back and apply the infinite scroll and infinite query. We're going to need one more hook at the top, and that is the useCallback hook. So after we've imported useCallback, we can begin working on this where we defined our last post ref. Actually, we're going to start with a different ref here, and I'm going to call this int observer. So we are going to use an intersection observer. You may have seen another tutorial or two apply infinite scroll with the scroll event, but that can become cumbersome for the UI, and the intersection observer is essentially designed for this type of thing. It's much better to use than listening for all the different scroll events and doing something on each event that occurs, because there are many of those scroll events. Okay, so now that we have our intersection observer, let's go ahead and define that last post ref once again, but now we set it equal to useCallback. And useCallback, we could just say post. This is essentially the element that we're going to have, so an article. So we're saving each post in an article. I'll just call it post here. And then with this post, we can do several things inside. One, we'll say if we're in the is loading state for any reason, we just want to return, because then we won't want whatever is about to happen here to happen. Otherwise, we're going to check that intersection observer, and we'll look at the current property, which you always have to do with the useRef. And remember, our intersection observer is a ref at this point. Then we're going to just say intersection observer.current.disconnect, which is something you can do with an intersection observer. So we're essentially telling it to stop looking if we already have one there. Otherwise, let's say intersection observer, and then we'll say .current is going to equal a new intersection observer. And now this is also going to receive posts. I think you might see this in MDN referred to as entries, something like that. We'll call it post to stay consistent with what we're doing. And now inside this function that the intersection observer calls, we'll say if, and then we'll have our posts. And of course, we're only going to have this one ref here, this one post. We'll say if it dot is intersecting, and we also need to check our has next page Boolean. So if we have determined there is a next page as well, then we'll say console.log. Here we can say we are near the last post. But then let's also go ahead and set the page number. And when we update that page number state, that is going to update our hook of usePosts, and it's going to request the next page of results. So we'll say set page num, and we'll get the previous value, and then we'll set that equal to previous plus 1 and save that much. But what we have left out a couple of things yet, what we still need to do to finish this. So let's find the useCallback. Here's the curly brace that finishes it. So we're not quite out of the woods for the whole useCallback. We'll also say if post, then we want to say intersection observer dot current. Once again, we have to use that current property with a ref, and then observe, and we're observing the post. And remember, this is all within the useCallback. So useCallback has a dependency array also. So we have to look at what we're providing here inside of useCallback. So we're looking at the is loading state that we get from our usePosts hook. We also use that has next page Boolean. So if those change, then useCallback needs to deliver a new last post ref. And as we scroll down here, we can see our last post ref is still going to be attached to that last component that we create out of the page of results. And let's check out our application now. By dragging this to the left, I want to refresh the page. Let's go ahead and get rid of the top even, just to make sure everything is as expected. So it should say localhost 3000. We now have our page of results, and we have a large scroll bar here to the right. But as we scroll down, I should take this to the full page actually, because we want to open up DevTools and see what we get in the console as well. So as we scroll down and we get close to number 10, let's see how close we can get, and before we see a message that we expect to get here, we're about to see post 9, and it says we are near the last post. So we're just about to scroll post 10 into view, and that's when the new query should have occurred with our usePosts hook. So did it? Yes, there's post ID number 11. So I'll try to scroll faster. We get that message again, and we've already got the next post as well. So I'll keep doing this, and we should see that we are near the last post rack up once for each page of results, and eventually we'll get to the bottom of 100 posts, and then we run out. There's no error, there's no problem, there's just no more results. So our has next page boolean is now false, and we can scroll back to the top if we want to. So that's how to create infinite query and infinite scroll with React only. Now in this next example, we're going to look at how to do it with React Query, and I think you'll find it's even easier. Okay, let's close the console here for DevTools, pull the browser back to the right, and let's bring VS Code back to the full screen. Now we're going to move on to React Query. So we need to go ahead and look at the package JSON, and we need to add that dependency. So control in the backtick. I'm going to press Control C to go ahead and stop the React app from running for now. I'm going to type npm I and then react-query. And this should quickly install that dependency, and we should see it up here. There it is when it's finished. That's good. Now we need to go to the index.js, because if we're using React Query, there's a couple of things we need to add here. So we're going to import the query client, and we're also going to get the query client provider, and both of those are going to come from React-query. After we do that, we also need to define the query client. So we'll say query client with camel case here now, and this is going to equal a new query client. And after that, we need to wrap our app component in the query client provider. So I'm going to just do the Control X here after I highlight that to take the app out briefly, and we'll put in the query client provider, and this has a client, and we set that equal to the query client that we created above. And I don't need that extra parentheses there, just the curly brace. There we go. And there's the closing query client provider tag. Now we can just paste the app right back here in the middle. Those are the changes we need to make to the index.js. And now let's create the example2 component. So another new file over here, and we'll just call this example2.js. And inside of example2, instead of the RAFCE that I would normally use to just create a quick functional component, I'm really just going to take example1, Control A to select all, Control C to copy all, go over here to example2, and Control V to paste everything in. Now I'll scroll to the top, highlight example1, Control D to select both instances of that, arrow to the right, and replace that with example2. Now we just need to make some changes to this component so it uses the infinite query hook from React Query, and that will put everything in place for us. Also, we can remove some things that we're not going to use. So to start out here at the top, instead of import usePosts, we're going to use the useInfiniteQuery hook from React Query. So I'll say import, and now we'll say useInfiniteQuery. That will come in from, we just need it from React Query. I'm not sure why it added that, but we can remove that much, and we'll just have from React Query. We can save that. Now let's look at what else we can remove here. Maybe the useState hook. As we will no longer need it to track the page numbers, React Query will do that for us. One other new thing that we will need, since we're not using that usePosts hook we created, is we'll need to import from Axios our getPosts page function that we created there. So we'll use it with our useInfiniteQuery hook. And now let's go ahead and remove this state with the page numbers, since React Query will track that for us. And instead of what we were pulling in from usePosts, I'll just highlight this and paste in what we're going to get from the useInfiniteQuery. And you can tell it's very similar. There is a fetch next page function that it provides, which is nice. And then we have the has next page, which is Boolean, that is much like the one that we created in our hook. We also have an is fetching next page if we want to use that instead of that is loading, really, although we could probably check the status to see if the page is loading as well. And then we're going to get data back. We could rename this results if we wanted to, or we could leave it as data. And then we're going to have an error if it exists. Now with React Query, this part needs to be just a little different as well. So we'll say useInfiniteQuery, and then the first parameter here in useInfiniteQuery is actually what it is labeled inside of the React Query cache. And so we don't really even need the brackets there. We just need to say posts, and that's how this will be identified inside of the React Query cache. And then we have a function, and this function is going to destructure, because this will be an object coming in. It's going to destructure the page param value, and we can put a default value of 1 here, although I believe we already did that with our function as well. And now that we have that, we'll go ahead and delete that second parentheses right there for now. And then we'll have our function that calls get posts page, and we'll pass in that page param. And the options here can stay blank because React Query will handle the abort controller for us. I'm going to press Alt-Z so some of this code just wraps down to the next line. And then we'll have a comma. And now we have a config object right here. And this has a function inside of it, and it's called get next page param. You should also know that useInfiniteQuery provides all of this, like has next page. It also has a has previous page, is fetching previous page, but we're not going to be using those at all. We're not going to be going in reverse for any reason, so we won't be using those with our example today, but do be aware that they do exist. Okay, so the get next page param is a function, and it gets the last page, and that last page is an array. So they're talking about a page of results. So there would be 10 posts inside of the last page, essentially. And then there's all pages, and this is where React Query keeps track of all the pages that it has requested or received already. So that's what would be there. And then we have the rest of the function here. So what we want to do inside the function is return the last page dot length. Remember, that's an array, and it should have 10 results, or it might be empty. So if it does have length, is essentially what we're saying here, then we're going to set the next page param to all pages that have been received so far dot length plus 1. Otherwise, we can just say it's undefined. And if this is undefined, then React Query knows that there is not another page. There is not another next page param, and so then the has next page Boolean will be false. So I believe I removed that opening closing parentheses, so it needs to be here at the bottom. There we go. It matches up, and we should be finished with calling the infinite query. And now let's move through the component and see what else needs to be changed. So we're no longer looking at is loading here. This would be is fetching next page, and if that's the case, we would return. After that, we will be able to call that fetch next page function, as we're no longer tracking the page number. React Query does that, so we'll just say fetch next page and call that function returned by the useInfiniteQuery hook. And since we previously named our Boolean has next page just like React Query, we don't need to change that. However, now our dependencies are different here. So instead of is loading, it has is fetching next page, and then we also use that fetch next page function. So let's just put it in here as well. And now below this, instead of checking is error, this is where we can check the status, which is a string. So we can say if status equals error. And then we will have an error, and then we should still be able to get the error.message, as error is also returned up here from our useInfiniteQuery. So that should check out as well. Now we're ready for our content. And the content is just a little more confusing with what we get back from React Query, because it actually puts it in a wrapper that has some other values in there as well. So instead of just being able to say results.map, we're going to bring this down here. And here we're going to have data that we get back, and then we check the pages, and then we can map over that. And now for each page, we can essentially go to the next level. And then I'm just going to take this and paste it inside of this next level, and we'll make some changes because we're going to map once again now that we're at that point. So now we need a return. So we'll say return. And once again, instead of results, this is going to be page. But now remember, each page that React Query refers to has those 10 results in it. So we'll say page.map. We'll map over each post in the page, and we're still going to use that iterator here. So then we're checking the page.length is i+1, so that's just essentially a rename, and we're checking our post. We're still applying the last post ref to that last component. Remember, it uses the forwardRef inside of that component. And so everything else here is the same, but it's a map within a map, just a little more complex than we had in our solution without React Query at that point. And finally, let's scroll down here to the JSX. We were once again checking is loading error, but here we're going to be checking is fetching next page instead. And that should all work out. So we'll save, and we should be ready to check our app out. But before we do, we need to go to the app.js and of course import. I'm just going to do Shift Alt and the down arrow and change example 1 here that I select, Control D, arrow to the end, switch that to example 2, and then switch this to example 2. Of course, you'll get a warning in the console that you're not using example 1 after you import it, but that's just to easily switch between these examples. Let's open up a terminal again, and we'll type npm start, and we'll see what we get for the app, or if I have made any mistakes along the way, it should launch here shortly. A full black screen, so I definitely missed something. Let's see what's going on. If we scroll up and look at the error message, cannot read properties of undefined reading pages. Oh yes, we didn't use optional chaining when we pulled that together. Let's go back and a quick fix for that. So we'll go back to example 2, and this is where we're creating that content that I said gets just a little more complicated. When the data first rolls through, it's going to be undefined, or pages would be undefined. So we need to use optional chaining right there. Let's save that, and now let's pull back over and look at the app. Looks good, except I forgot to switch example 2 or example 1 to example 2. So let's change that as well, just so we properly label our second example. This is example 2. It's not React only, it is React Query. And save, pull this back. Now everything looks like it should. We are using React Query's useInfiniteQuery hook, and we'll make sure this works in the same way. So let's come over here, we'll clean out the console now, and we'll start scrolling down to see if we get the same message and the same results. So as we get close to post number 10, we should get a message in the console. We got it. We are near the last post, and we are getting more posts as we go. So I'll scroll fast once again. Now using the useInfiniteQuery hook from React Query, it was easy to implement, and once we knew what we were doing from creating our own, I found it was a little bit easier to work with. It actually provided that other function. We didn't need to create a custom hook, and everything works the same. So 2 options that you have now learned to employ Infinite Query and Infinite Scroll in your React apps. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.